Awesome. All right. Welcome, everyone. It is February 17th, 2021. Welcome to the Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar for this week. It is good to see you all here today. We are lucky enough to have Dr. David Johnston speaking to us today about some really cool new toys for measuring and characterizing ecological processes at the shore and beyond. So Dr. Johnston is an associate professor of marine conservation and ecology in the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke University, and he's also director of the Marine Robotics and Remote Sensing Lab there at Duke. Dr. Johnston received his PhD from Duke University and then did a postdoc at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute in California. He's led research programs for NOAA, worked in the NGO world, now working in the academic space. And his research program currently focuses on advancing robotic applications, platforms, and sensors for marine science, education, and conservation. And he's published extensively in marine science, conservation biology, temperate and polar biomes, and his research sort of spans the world, but I think we'll mostly hear about coastal and marine applications today. And without further ado, David, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction, David. And I guess I'm going to share my screen now. Is that good timing?
Yep, please do. Thank you.
All right. Here we go. So I'm really excited to be here today. One of the really nice things about the pandemic is that we can get actually better connected through these virtual means. And while I would have loved to be able to come and visit and meet you all in person, I really cherish the opportunity to reach out and connect with you this way. So thank you. So for the talk today, I want to sort of pitch to you my big ideas for the past 5 years, right? And that I feel like our access to drones is essentially transforming how we can do marine science and conservation. And before you on this title slide, we have a picture of us, taken from one of our projects working in the Pribilofs, using a fixed wing drone to be able to fly over coastal systems there to look at habitat relationships between marine mammals that haul out, that use that land, and the kinds of habitats that are there, and how those may change over time. And so I want to try and I'm going to talk a lot about coastal things and some wetland stuff, but I'm also going to sneak in some whales and seals and birds and things like that as well, that help kind of drive home some of these points about why this technology is transformative. Okay. And so I'm going to, just to give you an outline of the talk and where I'm going, I want to start out with really briefly with just kind of introducing our lab and our competency in this area so that you have an idea that we know what we're talking about to some extent. And if you want more information, you can follow us on social media and, example on Twitter. We have a lot of information about what our lab's doing is presented, pretty frequently there. But I'm going to start off, a little bit about our lab, and then I want to kind of focus in on a quick sort of rundown of where I think drones fit into the toolbox for scientists that might be working on wetlands and other coastal systems and in the pelagic and terrestrial environments as well. And then I want to kind of sort of deconstruct that a little bit more and talk about sort of 5 key qualities that drones bring to our toolbox, and also some caveats, right? The things that limit their adoption. I want to talk about that as well. And then I want to present sort of 4 different research themes that I'm going to go through pretty quickly to kind of show you how we're applying this technology in our research and conservation efforts. And finally, just talk up, or wrap up really quickly with a focus on best practices, right? What are the ways that we can do this? And I'll start out by saying right away that this is probably the area where we need the most work, right? We have lots of people that are doing these kinds of things, but we have very little interoperability work between labs and amongst labs. And it's one of the things that I'm really excited about trying to do as we move forwards. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. So our mascot is a flying fish. We spend a lot of time flying drones over the water, and we don't use waterproof drones. We waterproof them by not landing on the water. But over the past 5 years, I've been setting up a lab at Duke that's basically trying to establish this technology and the methods that would be used to do various things in these pelagic and coastal environments. And essentially what we're talking about is on-demand remote sensing. I want to talk a little bit more about that as a key quality. But it's important to recognize that we can do this very quickly now because of the technological simplicity of things. This has allowed us to generate a lot of new approaches to things and help actually make new observations, and in some ways move beyond just change detection to understanding process. And I'll hopefully be able to show you that it can be safer, cheaper, and provide better data in some cases than alternative platforms. So that's kind of the role that our lab has been seeking to deal with. And on the bottom left here, there's kind of a little panel that shows some of our information about our flying time. We have 46 drones, different platforms that we fly. We've flown about 825 almost hours of flight time, which is a lot considering drone flights tend to be pretty short. And we've got, under our belt about 3,500 flights. And if you notice, there's a little bit of discrepancy here between flights and landings. And it makes sense that you would want to think that those landings and flights would be equal, but I can explain that later on in the questions, maybe, if people are interested. And lots of locations, we have worked across polar, temperate, and tropical biomes. So a lot of experience working in these areas. So that's kind of where our lab is at, and a quick sort of introduction to us. And then here's my pitch, right? This is the thing that I think is really important, and it's that drones can actually do some things that planes and satellites struggle at. And while we're seeing really great technological advances in both occupied aircraft and in satellite work, we're still able to fill a gap that remains. And this cartoon kind of gets at that, right? So up here, low Earth orbit, we've got satellites that are providing amazing information and getting better all the time. And then below that, we've got our occupied aircraft that are able to respond relatively quickly to events and are a little bit more logistically simple to task and get to places. But both of them have to deal with atmospheric effects that can limit their application. And in some places, that's actually really important, where there's lots of cloud cover all the time, like some of the places that we work on the Antarctic Peninsula. And up until about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the other option was, of course, our ecologists on the ground making really high resolution measurements. You go out, you put your quadrat down, you count the number of stems in a particular thing or the number of snails in that quadrat, and you collect really high resolution information in that little spot. And then, that's amazing, but it takes so much time to be able to cover that whole beach. We could take an entire class out to the Rachel Carson Reserve right across from us at the Marine Lab here, and we wouldn't be able to cover, only a small portion in the time that we might have allotted. And so right in the middle, in this space between the clouds and the things that we're interested in, are drones. They fit right in there. We can sample on the ground at centimeter scales. We know that we can be very accurate, and we can deal with some of the things that hamper our orbital and occupied aircraft platforms. And in particular, these things are related to the 5 qualities that I want to talk about that this technology is bringing to our science. Okay, so what are those 5 qualities that I think, and we've spent some time trying to lump these things together to explain to people why they might want to incorporate this technology. What does it bring that could up their game, right? Allow them to do things, in new ways that might be beneficial. And so we've been able to kind of categorize them into these 5 different things. We have affordability, immediacy, the efficiency of the tool, the quality of the data, and some safety aspects that are provided, right? And so those are those 5 key qualities. And then we also have this, at the bottom, I want to talk about these caveats, right? Where, not every job is going to be possible, right? Not every job is going to be enhanced by the application of this technology. But those are these 5 sort of key qualities that I want to introduce. And so I'm going to step through them now one at a time and give you examples to try and back up my argument, right? That these are game changers for us. So let's talk about affordability first. And that's kind of this concept of inexpensiveness or a low price to be able to facilitate what you want to do. And in this case, the cartoon's kind of illustrating an example for assessing, distribution of a species in a particular pelagic or coastal habitat. In this case, it might be seals on ice or in a coastal zone. And in many cases, you may be, the traditional approach would be focused on using occupied aircraft. There are some orbital platforms that can do this now, but usually this is something that's done with a helicopter or a fixed wing aircraft. And to be able to get into that game, it's pretty expensive, right? If you want to buy a helicopter, you're looking at around maybe $7.5 million. And in regular places, not extreme environments, you're going to pay up to $700 an hour or so, maybe more, maybe less, but right around there for flight costs, right? And then if you contrast that with a research grade drone, in this case, I've been talking about this Impossible Aerospace US-1, which can fly for 70 minutes to a multi-rotor aircraft. Maybe you can get that for $10,000. And then your price per flight is pretty low, right? And so this is a really important cost to think about, especially for people that have the ability and the right to be able to manage their coastal resources, but they may not necessarily have the money to purchase an occupied aircraft to do it, right? And so there are lots of examples now where this kind of technology, because of its affordableness, is democratizing data collection for management and science purposes. And to kind of put a cap on that, when we compared the costs for doing seal surveys in Canada versus an occupied aircraft, we came in at about 20% of those costs. Okay, so there's a platform cost that really shines in the affordability realm. And then let's talk a little bit about the data collection, the sensors, right? So it in fact is amazing how affordable research grade multispectral sensors are now to be able to do these things. So I have an example here. This is the MicaSense Ultim. It's like a little mini, Landsat in some ways, right? It collects information at bands that are similar to satellites, so blue, green, red, and then these near infrared red edge things, and also thermal infrared, that are really important to be able to do things like vegetation differentiation and looking at understanding wetness or the quality and quantity of vegetation in coastal environments. And from this single sensor, so each one of these is one of those bands with a thermal sensor, and radiometrically calibrated with information that's coming in from irradiance from the sun as well to be able to make more accurate measurements. You're able to, on a single flight, collect this suite of information at really, really high resolution. And that research grade sensor is less than $10,000 to be able to put on your drone and fly and do this. And so this is a really great example of how affordable it can be to get into a really quantitative remote sensing process with drones, and to be able to integrate that with workflows that might be taking advantage of things like satellite workflows as well. Okay, so that's our affordability pitch. I want to jump now and talk about immediacy, which is that ability to get right into it. And actually, it's kind of like this Zoom ability to do these seminars for other folks, right? Like, instead of having to travel and do all that stuff, we can immediately get connected through this technology. And drones do that for us to be able to do collection of data. And some of that is because there are limits to the use of occupied aircraft. They're not very spontaneous. They can't respond rapidly to events. And sometimes there are places where you actually don't have occupied aircraft support for science. So when we work down in Palmer Station in the Antarctic, we don't actually have really good access to aerial support for science. But drones can fill that gap, and they can do it right away, immediately. And that's particularly important because sometimes the things that we want to study aren't necessarily always available, right, at the surface. Or maybe they're transient, or maybe it's an oil spill, right, that happens quickly and you want to be able to actually get out there and see what's happening right away. This technology allows you to do that. We can get to an island, we can be in a situation and see something that we need to work on, and within 5 or 10 minutes be flying and collecting data, okay? And so the example that I have on the screen here, this cartoon shows us working from a boat and working with whales and trying to do photogrammetry to be able to study their body condition, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but also look at their behavior. And I have a video that kind of describes this immediacy to you in, I think, a pretty good way. And hopefully it'll translate well across the Zoom link. So here's that video. Hopefully this will play. And this is a video that it sort of goes along with a review that I did for the annual review of marine science. Can you guys see that? Is it streaming or is it on black? There we go.
There it is. Yep.
And so we're working from a small boat, a 4-meter rib. And in this case, I'm just the launch pad and the actual camera operator. The drone gets handed up to me. I apologize. You have to look up my nose for a few seconds there. But we're working from this little small boat, detected a group of whales, and within 5 minutes, we're able to get airborne. The aircraft takes off, it's hand launched and recovered. And if you look over my left shoulder there, you'll actually see a whale or two, and the aircraft is going to go over towards that. And the camera's then going to pan down and show what's happening in that area. So here's the surface of the water. And as the camera just sort of slides up the screen, you'll actually start to see a swirl of bubbles. And this is humpback whales that are bubble net feeding and using those bubbles to trap krill and come up through the center, working in a coordinated fashion to be able to optimize how much they get in their big gulps. And you'll see 4 animals emerge from this group of animals that are working together. And so this allows us to capture this really incredible behavior at the surface. But then as the animals move along, they stretch out at the surface and we're able to take still photos of them and capture information to be able to measure them, right? So using simple photogrammetric equations, we can scale every pixel in these images to a real world value and then start to understand more about their body condition. So and the video is just amazing to be able to be there and sort of show what that bubble net looks like when it comes to the surface and how those animals exit it is a pretty amazing thing. And then finally here, we have the recovery, which really speaks to trust between the pilot and the launch pad.
I think you've convinced us we don't need 3 more reasons. I mean, after that video, that's amazing. No, go ahead.
So that's my best example for immediacy that I have, and hopefully that translated pretty clearly to folks. And so up next, I want to talk a little bit about efficiency. Okay, so one of the things that we found is that using drones to be able to collect information, especially in a coastal context, can be incredibly efficient. So this cartoon here, it has our drone pilot and a fixed wing aircraft, and we're able to fly this coastline. We're able to generate very high resolution maps, centimeter scale, ground sampling distance, and also 3-dimensional maps of these places. And if we compare that to what you might want to do to build a 3-dimensional map of a coastline using a terrestrial laser scanner, you've got several people that you need to be able to actually, make that work. Even just to lug that equipment around and get it set up straight requires more effort. And one of the things that we have kind of gone through and figured out is that this kind of approach is really valuable when it comes to trying to optimize how much time we spend doing things. And one of my master's students, Anna Windle, is now a PhD student. She actually did this work where she looked at a GIS approach for estimating oyster habitat in our local National Estuarine Research Reserve. And being able to do drone flights and then having an analyst go through and actually outline those oyster reefs was a laborious process, but it actually allowed us to do a lot more in a shorter period of time, right? And so normally we would have someone with a GPS, and I'm tracing this red line around one of these reefs, where they would walk around with the GPS and outline the shellfish bed. And just being able to translate that into a high resolution mapping context and doing it, in the software meant that we could use a 30-minute UAS flight to capture 12 hectares of area. And then at the same time, if you were to try and do that walking around, you would survey only about 10 meters squared, right? And both of them have processing stuff on the end. And clearly the UAS stuff has a little bit more processing in the end on the others, But we'll talk about how we can automate that a little bit later on and really bring that efficiency up. But just being in the field, it gives you a sense of how much more data you can collect over a short period of time. So being affordable and immediate and efficient doesn't really help if the data that you create is crappy, right? And so one of the things that we always want to do is make sure that we're at least maintaining our quality data collection, if not making it better. And so here we have that similar context where we have a drone operator is using a multi-rotor aircraft here to be able to survey a coastline and the vegetation and animals that might be there. We're using ground control to be able to make sure that we're accurate and constrain our models and then check them. And when we do that, and again, in comparison to terrestrial-based methods, we actually come out very close, right? So our three-dimensional models of coastlines, our ability to count animals, all of those things are maintained while we use this new technology. And one of the key things that I think has been important for us when we think about the marine megafauna context is that there are research programs over time that have been capturing population estimates to maintain or develop an understanding of trends in abundance, right? And it's no good if we transition to a new method and those new measures, those new population estimates are biased because of the change in technology that we use to collect them. And so we've done some platform comparisons. So here we have a situation where we're flying for gray seals in the eastern United States and in Canada. And the traditional method, again, was some occupied aircraft. So here we have a twin otter that might have 4 people in it with some motion compensated cameras to be flying over these colonies. And here's our little foam airplane that we use to fly over those same areas. And when we do that, we can compare that imagery. So up top here, we have our foam airplane, our drone imagery, and then here's the twin otter imagery. And when you look at those, qualitatively, really, there turns out to be very little difference between the two, right? And when we do the comparisons, the differences that are made by counting both occupied aircraft and drone-based imagery are quite small, and often fall within the error of individual, people looking at different maps and counting them manually. So we feel really confident that we can trust the data, right? That the data that we're collecting through this technology is high quality and worthy of incorporating into some of these population assessment programs. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move along. I want to talk a little bit about safety, right? So I think when people think about drones, they often think about safety as a negative thing, that we worry about interactions between occupied aircraft and drones, and that those outcomes are bad, and they are, but they're very infrequent. And the safety part is actually, kind of flipped in ways, right? And so in this cartoon, we actually compare, thinking about doing a survey for pelagic animals using a long endurance UAS versus, an occupied aircraft that's got maybe, 4 people on board, right? Pilot, co-pilot, a couple of observers. And while I'm not saying that we would ever eliminate the use of occupied aircraft for these kinds of things, there may be situations where we can reduce human risk by actually having robots that fly out and do that for us, right? So on board here is just zeros and ones, right? That's all. And so this is an opportunity to reduce that risk, and we know it's real. There's a paper published by SAS. It's in the Wildlife Biology Bulletin, and that paper looked at sources of mortality for wildlife biologists, and up until about 2001, I believe, and from the 1960s or 70s up until then, and 66% were related to aviation, right? So we know that this is a risky thing for wildlife biologists and ecologists. So safety can be enhanced by using robots, and they're not necessarily always applicable, but as these technologies become more useful and more capable, then we may be able to actually make serious safety gains for people. There's also safety for the environment, and so we can think about ways to reduce our effects on the environment when we go in to survey and do our work. And so this is actually a Google Earth picture Middlemarsh, which is part of the National Estuarine Research Reserve right off of the Duke Marine Lab. And it's a beautiful sort of labyrinth of oyster reefs and seagrass and marsh. And right away, you'll see there's some linear structures here in the marsh. I'm just outlining them in red, and I'll get rid of that. And those are actually the paths of researchers that are estimating productivity in the marsh. And they do those repeatedly. They're collecting really great information, but that information comes at a cost. And those are these paths that actually don't regrow after people walk through them. And so it's a really interesting example of how we may be able to use this technology to reduce the number of times that we have to go in to the habitat and disrupt it, right? And there's probably lots of other different ways to think about this, but this is a good one. And to the credit, this was brought to our attention by the researchers doing the work. They came to us and they said, look, we're doing this work. Can we do this in a way that doesn't result in this kind of interaction? So it's pretty cool to think about ways that this can extend our operations safely and reduce our impacts on the environment. All right, so let's talk about the caveats. Okay, this all sounds really great, right? I'm selling it pretty hard to you folks, but there are clearly lots of drawbacks. And so this cartoon tries to get at some of those, like, yeah, we might disturb animals, and leopard seals don't really live on the grass, but you can see they're angry and they may be frightened by that drone. And then, we've got some law enforcement people that are there, and there's a drone operator, and that person's flying a drone, and it might be over people. Right. So we have all of these things that we haven't really worked out. One of them is the regulatory part, right? We are not allowed to fly over people without a waiver from the FAA. We're not allowed to fly beyond line of sight without a waiver from the FAA. And those things are actually really constraining for a lot of the work that we want to do. The technology can do this safely and very efficiently, and I've argued those things, but the regulatory sort of environment has not been able to keep pace with the technological advancement of this. And so that limits how you can apply them. And really it comes down to scalability, right? It's really difficult to scale to big, larger projects when we have these regulatory limits. We also don't know a lot about the long-term, sort of quality or capabilities of parts of individual drones. So how long does the propeller last? How long does your battery last? There's a lot of things like that we're working through. But these are the kinds of caveats that we have to think about when applying drones to these kinds of coastal and pelagic systems. The disturbance of animals is something that's very important to us, and we assess it both acoustically and when we can visually. But the truth is, it's very context specific. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to be able to get past some of the issues that we have there. But we're making headways. But these are the things that temper our ability and our enthusiasm sometimes for using drones for particular operations. All right, I want to reshuffle that. So we switched the cartoon now. We have our drone operator, and they're flying a fixed wing drone here, and they're trying to count how many birds that are here. Right. I want to be able to do that. And if we didn't have the drone, the person would have a certain perspective and would be trying to count those animals, but they might miss ones because they're behind a rock, or they might miss ones because they're behind another bird. Right. And we have lots of interesting perspective issues that drones can help us with when it comes to these kind of population estimate type things. And so I want to talk a little bit about our case of studying seals in Canada, and I have a video that kind of shows this operation. And I hope again it plays for you okay. But this will actually show the launch of this little foam airplane, SenseFly EV, the software that we use to control it in flight and how it flies, and then a little bit about the landing and the data, what the environment looks like. So, and again, this was supplemental to the paper that we put in the Annual Reviews of Marine Science. It gives you a good sense of what's going on. You actually shake the airplane 3 times, it starts up, and you pitch it in the air. This is a software that we use to be able to control that aircraft. It shows you the pictures, the footprint of the pictures that it's taking on the ground. Here are some examples of those photos. that depict where the seals are. And this is what that environment is like. It's the spring in Canada, it's cold. The blood that you see on the ice there is actually from seals that are giving birth. So we do these surveys at the time that the animals are pupping so that we can access that life stage and help us build, population estimate through a biological model. The aircraft circles when it comes home and it chooses the right approach vector into the wind for most control and comes and just touches down in the snow. We often try and catch it. It's kind of hit or miss. We're maybe at 60%. It depends on, what kind of habitat we're stumbling around as we're trying to actually grab it before it hits the ground. So that's kind of a quick overview of those operations. And when you take all those images and you stitch them together, you get a colony map of this seal colony. And in this map, if I was to zoom in on it, we're talking about 3 centimeters on the ground per pixel resolution, right? So we're able to tell mothers and pups from each other and, where those seals are. And I'll draw attention to a couple of seals that are out here. They got voted off the island, but they're a good sort of place marker when I show you the next image. So this is done with a standard RGB camera. In fact, when they first came out, they were modified point and shoot cameras that were put in these drones. So incredible use of that technology. But we also have problems with, some vegetation on the island, and seals like to get up in here. They're not arboreal, but they can hang out underneath the trees sometimes. And we can get at some of that if we use the thermal camera, right? So here's a thermal image of that colony taken around almost the same time. And we can actually see that some seals are actually finding refuge up amongst these trees that might be really cryptic for people trying to see them just in the RGB imagery, right? And if we go back up to those 2 seals that were voted off the island, you can see they're pretty obvious up there. And so, this thermal thing really is a game changer for people that are interested in trying to understand distributions of animals that might be different from the background. So any homeotherms, and also thinking about microclimates as well, right? So if you look at the background, don't focus on the bright spots, but focus on the sea ice. We can see really interesting variation in the sea ice habitats, right? That are probably important for a number of different things. And that can be translated across different habitats. And the work on this is just beginning, I think. When we translate those to counts, we can go to certain places and look at how counts are growing. And this is data from a colony on Muskegon Island, which is up, in the New England area. And gray seals are recovering from depletion, right? And you can see that population has grown, and we're able to confidently use our UAS counts to complement what's been doing on the ground, to be able to fill out information about how that population is changing over time. So that's our population assessment example. We also can do a lot of work with individual animals. So in this cartoon, we're showing, a researcher, like I was showing you before in the video, launching a drone from a small boat, and then being able to take images of these whales, and then thinking about how to measure them, right? How do we gain information about these animals in a useful way? And so it turns out there's lots of tools that allow us to translate these photos into real data. One of the things that my lab really likes to focus on is open science. And so my students and my colleagues in my lab do a lot of work on open publications and open data and open software. And my PhD student, Casey Berlick, is a genius kid who's been helping us do all of this work, has developed a software system with one of his colleagues to be able to measure whales in a semi-automatic way. You import the image, and you're then able to draw a line down the length of the animal and automatically subsections it, and then you can actually measure the widths of this animal, as you go through, and that helps us understand the body condition of the animals. And we can then model that and see how it changes through time. And he's just finishing up his dissertation now, be graduating this spring. And here's an example of some of his data. This is for whales on the Antarctic Peninsula. And these are measures of body condition that are done through time, right, through the austral summer. And each one of these black dots is a measurement with a Bayesian error estimate associated with that measurement. And this red line fits a a growth curve, right? As that population seems to be growing in size through the summer, right? They've made this big migration down to the Antarctic Peninsula. They're skinny. They start to fatten up, get ready for the next breeding season. So, and this is a really cool application of this technology that can be applied to everything. One of the next things that we'd like to work on is our wild horses here in North Carolina. We could do very similar things. And then kind of building on that, we can think about this as in an integrated ecology sense. And so just a quick video that shows us putting a tag on a humpback whale. So this long end of that pole, there's a tag. It gets stuck on the back of the whale. It's got a camera on the front of it, and off it goes. But the key thing about that tag is that it has accelerometers on it that help us understand the performance of that animal as it's moving underwater, right? Normally, when the animal leaves the surface, it's difficult for us to understand what's going on. But these new tags are fantastic in that they give us information about what's happening below the surface in 3 dimensions. And so this next little video actually shows the path of a whale. So this ribbon is the path. Each one of these chevrons is a second. These carrots here indicate where the animal's feeding its tail, and you can actually track the depth down here in the corner. This is actually the depth profile along the top here. And I'll just play this video, and you'll actually get to see what that actually looks like. It's on a dive. The whale's fluking. And let me get rid of these annotations. You can see it's actually making these maneuvers, turning, and up ahead, it's going to actually mow the lawn. And what's really nice now is that we can measure these animals and understand their morphology and then compare that to performance. So now we understand whether you're big or small or how you're configured can alter your performance as a forager when you leave the surface, right? These are observations that are easy to make if you're looking over predators on the savanna, but really almost impossible to make when you're thinking about animals that are leaving the surface. So this is kind of that integrated ecology where drone imagery can be sort of fit into other systems, right? To understand more about, basic biological and ecological relationships. And if we skip back to that bubble net feeding that I showed you at the surface, this is what it looks like when a whale does that for a few hours when it's been tagged. It's like a robot, and just continually, it must be dizzy for spinning around and around and around. But now we can actually look at that behavior at the surface, the nets that are created, and then link that to the movements of the animal subsurface. So, all right, so let's talk a little bit more about wetlands now. I've kind of been focusing on the non-wetland stuff, and we're going to jump into the habitat stuff. But here, we're shuffling it again. Our drone operator is flying a drone. We can do very accurate things because we've got high resolution GPS information. So think about, RTK enabled drones that are collecting really accurate positional information with good ground control. And we can start to understand how these environments are changing with time and with, natural experiments or things that we might do. And this is a video of post-hurricane, Beaufort, just outside of where the Marine Lab is, as the water is still high and waves are propagating over the island, right? And it's kind of classic barrier island stuff where you see these waves, they're coming across, depositing material in behind, and so we can now think about flying just before a storm and after, so high immediacy, very high quality data. And figure out what an individual storm does to a beach, right? And that's something that's been more challenging with occupied aircraft and satellites. So the aircraft's going to take a bit of a jaunt to the right now and speed up, and hopefully no one gets motion sickness. Quickly see the Duke Marine Lab on the right there, and then we're going to spin around, and it's going to come in and actually sort of transition to what those data look like, and the data that I'm going to show you in 2 dimensions in a minute. But this is a 3-dimensional reconstruction of that beach at very, very low tide. And it gives us incredible information about the topography and the geomorphology of the actual habitats, okay? So let's talk a little bit about that area. So the flight that I just showed you is part of the Rachel Carson Reserve, and it's essentially this area up here, right up here at the top part of this map, okay? And we've been doing a lot of work looking at how these habitats are evolving over time. And this overview map shows a series of study areas that we've used to be able to look at habitat changes, right? And so there's images, the image actually shows information about different ground control points that we use and how we've been able to sort of understand the different habitats, the tidal flats, the foreshore, and the terraces and things like that. And as we've been monitoring these habitats over time, we've seen that they kind of breathe, right? They have a disturbance, they recover, and then they change how they do or they change their configuration. So on the left here is a map of elevation change, right? So red is where we've got a reduction in about a meter in elevation, and green is about a meter increase. Okay. And so at the top here, and we have right after the hurricane, and you can see that this red area here was very highly eroded, and that a lot of sand was deposited in behind the strand there. And then as the beach recovered, we actually see these green area here in the foreshore where that sand that was lost, has recovered, right? It's come back in. And then as we move forwards and look at this island's trajectory over time from 2016 through to 2018, we see more erosion, on the western side and more accretion on the eastern side. And that in the end, we have sort of net transport of sand to the east, right? And that this is actually no longer acting like a fetch limited barrier island, which is what we think of this island tucked away in behind the Outer Banks, but that it's responding more, in a different way. And on the right-hand side, we just have these isolines, the 2.25 meter isolines for comparison. And the thing is to look at, in the eastern end of that, the most recent data, which is in pink, has kind of pressed out this flat, right? So we see that it's expanding on this eastern side through time. And this is all done with drones and photogrammetry, structure from motion, to be able to calculate these volumetric changes and elevation changes. We've also been trying to figure out how to take advantage of the technology to understand vegetation cover. And so we've been working on mapping the canopy heights of marsh grasses in this area. And this is work that was led by an undergraduate in my lab, Alexandra DiGiacomo. And in this case, we used multispectral information from the drone and optical information from the drone to try and tease out the background versus the canopy height. So we can identify the vegetation with an NDVI raster, right? A typical vegetation index, find the ground points that are associated with low vegetation, and then create a digital terrain model from that. And at the same time, use structure from motion to create the canopy height of the actual marsh grass, and then subtract the two to develop a vegetation model, right? And we can do that with different kinds of terrain models, ones that are generated by LiDAR and ones that are generated by going in and just actually making manual points for the comparison. And when we do that, it turns out that we can actually get pretty close to reality. We know that the structure from motion always underestimates the canopy height, but it can be modeled, adjusted to be able to take advantage of the consistency in that. And that whether we're using a point cloud or LiDAR information or just manual measurements, we can actually get pretty close to the true stem height and good estimates of above ground biomass for marsh grasses. And this paper was published in remote sensing, and I can pass it on to folks if people are interested. But a really great way to think about not having to go into the marsh to measure those things, but trying to do it remotely in a more efficient way. And so now I want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of efficiency, and think about how we use these data in an artificial intelligence sort of workflow. So take you back to the North Carolina Estuarine Research Reserve here, the Rachel Carson Reserve, and Anna's work on outlining all of those oyster reefs was really useful because it set up training data for us to be able to develop a deep learning model to be able to identify oyster reef in drone imagery. And so here's an example of all of those reefs. You can see all these things in red that are outlined in these areas. And this is really great training information to go into a neural network to be able to then detect imagery automatically, oysters and imagery automatically. And so this was work led by Justin Ridge, so whiz kid research scientist that works with me. And he took that manually labeled data, subsetted it for testing and validation, but trained a neural network to be able to identify oysters in this information and then predict those areas in the imagery that we can then actually compare with the test data. And when we do that, it's pretty amazing how well it works. So despite the fact that it's kind of hard for us to even see where oysters are and aren't sometimes, it did a great job. So this is the basic ortho imagery at the top. Here's our manual polygons that would be either used as training data or as testing data. And then here's what's predicted. And, you know, there's some kind of goofy areas where things don't necessarily always match up. But for the most case, it's pretty amazing how well the model does. And in fact, when we do go back and look at the testing and training data, we actually see that the OysterNet application actually finds some oysters that people don't, right? And one of our things that we're learning is that when we apply machine learning methods to drone data, sometimes analyst fatigue turns out to be a problem, especially when you're thinking about counting birds or things, you know, very repetitive tasks. But this is, you know, freely available and now is useful to be able to estimate accurately the oyster coverage in these coastal environments. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is the human revolution and, you know, thinking a little bit about where people fit in. And so here we have, maybe this is a Florida beach, and we're interested in how people are using this particular location. And drones can provide really unique information, right, about human behavior in the context of use of coastal and ocean resources. We can understand what they're doing. We can understand maybe if they're doing something that's illegal, maybe even support law enforcement action, right? All sorts of things that are possible. But it's really not clear how that affects privacy and security of the individual, right? And so this is a really important thing that we've been trying to work on. And that we've working on this because we've been asked by folks, you know, can we use drones to be able to do that? Can we actually see how people might be using a marine park? Or how do we estimate recreational fishing effort? In the absence of other ways to collect data, often which don't produce really great results, can drones be used? And so we have been approached to do these kinds of things, and we actually didn't know, you know, technologically we could do it right away, but we didn't know if we should, right? And so this big question about how do we do this ethically and legally, first and foremost, is a really interesting question. And so one of the things that we did is we actually convened a course with our environmental law and policy clinic called the Game of Drones. We brought these law students together and we threw this at them and said, is it legal for us to go and fly over people in the Cape Lookout National Seashore and tell the National Park Service where those people are? So they went out and they accumulated all of the case law and everything for this. And then they came back with the results of that. And the results were published in this paper. And so I can send the link out to everybody if you're interested, but it's open access. And essentially, you know, short story, legally, we could probably do that. And legally, we could probably use drones to be able to estimate recreational fishing, you know, in a tidal creek here in North Carolina. The question of whether that's ethical still is out there, right? We're still trying to figure that out. And some of that has to do with the lack of information and education about how this technology might be used. But last thing is that led us to our understanding that best practices really don't just deal with things like operations and maintenance and record keeping, right? Things that are very obvious, right? Like how do we collect the best data? How do we not crash? How do we, do those sorts of things? But maybe we needed to think more about the legal and ethical things. Clearly, we think about this in terms of animal disturbance, but there are other parts of that as well. And then started to think about other things like accountability. So if we're working, say, in a foreign nation, we crash a drone and the LiPo battery explodes in a fire and burns down someone's field, who's responsible for that? How do we deal with that, right? And that led us to think more a little bit about social justice and governance and decision-making things that are associated with working in other cultures that are very rarely thought of when we think about taking this kinds of technologies to those places. So that's kind of our best practices. And ultimately we're working on on some sort of comprehensive set. And this is work that's being done by my PhD student, Rhett Newton. And if you look at this, really quickly, we've got two different axes. We have, going from the general over here to the very specific, over here. We're thinking about what you need to build a program, from the vision of that program to how it might be perceived by a community that you might be working in, to building the program, all the way to, how do you best practice deal with your data at the very end, right? Where does it go? How is it saved? And those kinds of things. And so this is the kind of thing that we need to do as we develop our program and make it, professional and accountable and useful for everyone as we move forward. So that's it. That's all I have. I'm happy now to take questions. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you so much. That is an incredible scope that you prepared for us. And so we do have a bunch of questions actually coming in. I'm going to stop that for now. And I'll go back and forth. I know if students have to run to class, that's fine, but I'll go back and forth from the Zoom room to the YouTube and start with a couple of things we got on Zoom. So first, a technical issue about the counting populations or even individuals. When you're flying a drone and you're seeing, just even counting individuals, how many passes do you have to make sure your drone has enough pictures? What kind of overlaps do you need to hit?
Yeah, so depending on the mode, whether you're thinking about a picture as a sample versus trying to build a map, it's different. If it's just a sample, then it's one flight. And you think about transects in more of a strip sampling or distance sampling context. In the mapping context, we want to have enough overlap that we can stitch the images together, but we don't want to fly multiple times over the animals, especially at longer time frames. We really want to be able to capture as many images of the animals that we're interested in right away. And so flight planning turns out to be really important, so that we're not capturing an image of a seal, at one point in time and then 10 minutes down the road as a drone comes back, because it may have moved or whatever, and it can cause problems with the map building process.
So in other words, it depends on the question and also the organism.
Yes, it does.
So, the major question is why is anyone on this Zoom or YouTube not working for David Johnston? Because this is just so cool, the kind of work that you're doing. We have a lot of questions. It sounds like people want to do this in their research lives. So I'm going to I'll drop a couple for you from the YouTube. So is it possible yet to carry bathymetric LiDAR? And what is the largest range for non-military drones? So we'll start with those two.
Yeah, so there are a couple of topobathymetric LiDARs that are available now that give you the bathymetry in clear water and also the surface of the water, so you can match that up to anything that you do on land. The range depends on your battery life, and as you put more bigger batteries on, you eventually kind of max out range. Legally, we're not allowed to fly beyond line of sight. But we can set up aircraft, even small aircraft, that can fly for 45 minutes and send them on a 25-kilometer mission, over the ocean. And we've done some beyond line of sight work in places where that's legal. And these missions can be 30 minutes long and, out several kilometers over the ocean and back without a problem.
Yeah, it seems like it's really expanding. And you noted in the beginning, there's a lot of people our esteemed Dr. Clark has a drone. He runs flights. I have a drone in my lab. I don't know how to use it, but my students throw it up in the air. So there's a whole range of, I think, expertise. And so I've got a question from YouTube, what's just generally the learning curve? If someone knows how to do remote sensing and is a field ecologist, what's the learning curve to get, good data from a drone? And do the instruments come with their own software, or do you need to, do post-processing in R or some other external program?
Yeah. So the learning curve, actually, it's, if you're already familiar with remote sensing and ecology, that's probably the steepest part of the learning curve. So you're really good there. Learning to fly a drone is not that difficult. There are some people who have general aptitude and some people who don't, right? Depends on the individual. But you can get your Part 107 after studying for a few days and be legal. And then, it really gets down to competency. And I would recommend that you take a course where people teach you about not just how to fly a drone, and what the FAA regulations are, but how you collect data, appropriately in the environment, thinking about the environments that you're working in, sun angle and glare, and all of those things. So, but the learning to fly a drone part is really just practice, and I think that's probably the easiest part. The drone software stuff is more challenging, and usually the software that will come with the drone will just be for operation. In some cases, there are packages for collection of data through standardized flight planning and things like that. Many of those are actually free that you can download, and we'll work with a number of drones. And then the software to do the analysis from drones, say into maybe the mapping context and doing structure from motion, is available. That all of those systems will output information that you could then take into R or ArcGIS, whatever your favorite geospatial workflow is. It's all pretty standard these days.
Great, thanks. I'll give you one more question from Anastasia in the room. So thinking about getting good flights and good missions, the weather seems really important. So what's the solution for wind, rain, sea breeze, high humidity? You have to scrap missions, or you can pretty flexible?
Yeah, we can collect good data with most of our aircraft in up to about 22 knots of wind. When it starts to rain or snow, even if the winds are slow, that messes up the imagery, and so it becomes less. Even if your drone is environmentally sealed, so we have some aircraft that we can fly in adverse weather. So in many ways, we're really looking for optimal conditions, and so that can be challenging. So we've definitely had to scrub missions, and even partway through when winds come up, things like that. Many of the aircraft have fail safes in them, so if they experience a certain wind speed, they just say, "I'm coming home," because it's getting dangerous.
All right, and I've got one for you, Mark. If you got something, I know you've been in the drones, but just in general, are you? So you have developed these systems, developing this huge expertise, the best professional judgment, like it. Are you working as as like a contract agent? Like at this point, someone has a problem and they come and they talk to the drone robot sort of lab, and you work with a researcher across institutions to devise solutions? Or are you more like you're a marine scientist and you're progressing your own sort of research using this as a platform?
Yeah, it's both really. So we definitely partner with people, other agencies. We partnered within Duke with archaeologists to work on things. We work with government agencies. In some cases, it's to collect the data and then provide just the data. Sometimes it's to provide a more complete solution in terms of analysis and things like that. And so it's kind of a combination of both.
All right, we'll close it up with one last question from YouTube. This is from Collier Woolston, regarding disturbance of animals and the need to fly as few flights as possible. How do you account for the collective disturbance from other drone users and researchers, and this sort of cumulative impact of, by observing something, you change it and potentially harm it?
Right. Yeah. It's a really, really important question. And so for the most part, a lot of the time in the little places that we're working, we haven't really had to deal with a lot of cumulative impacts. We're working in pretty remote locations and with animals that aren't necessarily always or frequently exposed. But I recognize there are a lot of contexts where that's occurring, and it's a challenge, right? I think the best thing to be able to do is to work with there's lots of local user groups that develop best practices to be able to access and fly over animals and different maybe sensitive habitats. Always make sure that you're conforming to regulations if you're working in a national park or in some other type of protected area, because they often prohibit the use of drones. And I think the key is to be really cognizant and not just rely on what you may have experienced before. Ethics is that muscle that we need to flex every day. And that means that you're paying attention to what's happening while you're doing it. And if you see what you think is some form of disturbance, then you need to stop, right? And you need to reevaluate and figure out how you need to do that, and how to do that in a way that's going to be sufficient for your data collection, but also not going to compromise the needs of the environment.
Awesome. Well, thank you, David. You took us from, from science to tool to ethics all the way, which is a nice scope for one presentation. So let's give Dr. Johnston a round of applause, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And of course, the recording will be available for everyone. Next week, if you will join us again, we are hearing from, anyone have it at hand? It's going to be
Anna Armitage.
Oh, great. We're going to hear from Anna Armitage from Texas, right?
Yep. Texas
Climate
A&M.
change and coastal ecosystems. So mangroves and the consequences of climate change. All right. Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you all next week.